everybody, it's Drybear. After just about 60 hours on the Elden Ring DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, I wanted to give my full review of my experience overall. And to help kind of put this in perspective, because this is just my opinion, my perspective on the game, I have played every Souls game and most of the Souls-likes that go in the genre as well, and I tend to like higher challenge and higher difficulty, even if it means I'm slamming my head against something in general. So I have a general positive view of most of the Souls games, all the Souls games. Let's not talk about Dark Souls 2 too much. And this is your warning about spoilers as well, as I will be talking about some of the bosses and some of the experiences and some of the area for the DLC as well. And I think it's also important to talk about what this DLC means for the game, because we know this is going to be the only DLC for Elden Ring, and so we're not going to be getting more. And personally, I think this is actually an excellent send-off for Elden Ring as the only DLC we have. So overall, I think the DLC was absolutely fantastic. If I had to give it a rating out of 10, I'd probably give it an 8 or a 9. I think there was definitely some issues that they could have sorted out prior to launching, and there were some experiences that I think felt a little bit undercooked or just didn't seem to fit in the overall experience for Shadow of the Erdtree. But I think it fits the game really well. They did a good job adding a bunch of new weapons, combinations, talismans, so that when people go back in time and they replay Elden Ring or they replay the DLC, they can keep trying new builds, and that's what made Elden Ring so fun for such a long time over the last few years, has been the build variety and the skill expression you can have and the different experiences you can have. We know that you can just keep going back and playing in a couple years, even though we're not getting more DLCs, you'll be able to combine these together. Now, not all of the weapon types were a huge success. I think some of them just felt either a little bit too weak. I didn't find the Smith Script weapons to be all that great overall. I did enjoy the Smith Script Great Hammer in general, but it kind of devolves into a Great Hammer most of the time just because the swing from the heavy attack takes so much stamina. I also tried the axe, the spear, and the daggers, and overall I was just not impressed with the amount of damage and scaling that they had. I think they were trying to be extra careful with those so that they didn't scale too much out of control. Like their buildup was low, their damage was low, their scaling was low, but they were pretty fun and kind of, novel to play with, to say the least. Many of the boss weapons were super cool and very unique. The Putrescent Knight weapon had really cool, unique animations. There's a lot of floaty flying animations with the Death Knight weapons, Romina's weapon, or Mesmer's weapon. They give you a lot of really cool mobility options, iframe options, and some new gameplay that didn't really exist before. However, the base game and DLC suffer from a similar problem, and I'm just going to call it the poise problem, in that there are certain weapons and certain playstyles that focus on staggering the enemy, that focus on dealing high poise damage, like Starfist, any major colossal weapon, and those still kind of trivialize the game, whether it's DLC or base. I've watched people go up to Rilana for the first time, charge attack twice, stagger her, charge attack twice, stagger her, and kill her in one go without her even being able to attack them because of the poise is there. And I think the flip side is true as well. If you ran the reverse grip blades for the DLC, if you ran the beast claws or the martial arts fists, or you ran like caster builds, I think the DLC gets significantly harder because, again, the game is so abusable with poise damage and staggering that it becomes this night and day. Now, this is one of the pros in a sense for Elden Ring in general, because you're able to create your own difficulty. And I think a lot of people that struggled with the DLC didn't fully understand this. They maybe have stuck with a sorcery build or an incantation build, or maybe they were really attached to the new beast claws and they wanted to use them for everything without realizing that some builds end up having a much harder time playing the game than others, and that's kind of your choice on what you want to play and how you want to play the game. On top of that, I think there was a lot of balancing issues, primarily with the global scaler that they applied to the whole game. This is the Scadutree Blessing, comprised of the Scadutree fragments that you find throughout it. And so I think that the core design of that system was needed and also was quite effective for what they were trying to accomplish, in that they wanted the DLC to have its own scaling, so that whether you're coming in new game +1 level 500 or you're coming in mid game level 60, they wanted you to have that feeling of coming in, getting rocked by the enemies you're running into, and then slowly getting stronger as part of the DLC itself and working your way up to being strong at the end. And in general, it did work. When you start out with 0 Scadutree Blessings versus when you have, 10 to 20 of them, it makes a significant significant difference in how powerful you feel and does have its own scaling system. However, anytime in game design that you apply a scaler, like a percentage modifier, over the entire game, there's going to be some areas that scale well with that, and there's going to be some areas that definitely don't. And I would say about 60 to 70% of the DLC felt fine with this scaling system, but there were some enemies that just felt like they scaled way wrong, like they were just completely out of control. Sometimes you'd get hit by a bat, or you'd get hit by like a random like these enemies here from the mesmer soldiers sometimes would just do you know, like an entire screen's worth of health bar in a single hit, or they would just get some really weird hits that just felt absolutely wrong. But again, if you don't like this, you don't like this kind of difficulty, you had the option to scour the world, explore, get more Scatter Tree fragments, raise your vigor, change your build, and still fit through it. So I think overall, it's up to the player to smooth it out, but I think they definitely should have put maybe a little bit more time or testing into making the scaling, like the actual progression curve for the Scatter Tree Blessing work well, which by the way, for live patching, they've already patched it once to change the early scaling on it to fix some of these problems. So I think this scaling system aside, the poise problem aside, it's a good entry. It's a good send-off for Elden Ring overall. There's a lot of really cool new builds and playstyles you can make from this, a bunch of new spells and combinations, and I think there's a bunch of new experiences that fit the game as well. So overall, from that perspective, like the gameplay portion, I think it's awesome. It's actually really good. Now let's talk about the encounters, because there's a bunch of encounters, there's a bunch of new bosses, a lot of really new original content that works for the game. And let's start with what is probably the most trash encounter in the entire game, the Furnace Giant. I'm actually convinced that if these were just statues that you looked at, the DLC probably would have been a better experience, because these things are absolutely just the worst experience I've ever had. I actually looked at them the first time, the Furnace Giants, and I thought to myself, wow, that's incredible. Although there was awe, you saw them from a distance. They're so unique. They're like this wicker kind of like fire pit look, bonfire look, super cool. They have some aesthetic references to Fire Giant with the rope and the images, but once you actually fight against them for more than a minute, you start to realize that these things are just horrible to fight. They're incredibly boring. They're not challenging in any way. They spam the same abilities over and over. They have the most annoying projectile-based attacks, and some of them did require a little bit of a trick. You needed to craft the furnace pots to throw them in top of the head, which you get from a note, which is fine, but because it's the Furnace Giants, I didn't even feel that spirit of whimsy of like, let's figure this out. I just kind of felt like I wanted to walk away, because the armored Furnace Giants, it was just too much of a hassle. To be honest with you, I would rather deep clean my bathroom than fight a bunch of these Furnace Giants in a row. They are just so incredibly boring. Which is not to say that there aren't enemies in the base game that I just didn't enjoy or thought weren't all that interesting, but these to me felt less like it was, you know, I'm working my way through trash mobs, and more like I was doing chores. It just took so long, and maybe this was part of the Scatter Tree Blessing scaling system, the fact that they had ridiculous health and ridiculous poise. The trick with them is you have to stagger them, punch them in the face, do that twice, and they're gone, but they have incredible amounts of poise, so you have to hit them for long periods of time. Depending on what your build is, you might spend anywhere from like 4 to 10 minutes just wailing on their ankles, biting over and over, trying to get them to fall over, and it's just not fun in any way. Now, there are some awesome fights in this DLC. I think Rolana is one of the best Souls fights that they have. I put it up there with like Slave Knight Gale, or even like Orphan of Kos. I really, really enjoy Rolana, and personally, I really like fights that are just generally fair but fierce. You know what I mean? Like, they don't do anything that's just really kind of nonsense, or you feel like you're being cheated out of it. They're just good and hard, and they get in your face and they never let you breathe. Now again, if you ran like Star Fists or the Colossal Great Hammer or the Blood Fiend's arm with bleed, you could just burn right through her. Especially if you did the Rolling Sparks build with the perfume bottle, you could very easily burn right through her. But I think you're missing out on an incredible fight that is super fun and very enjoyable to go against. And this is like kind of what I hope most Souls And Souls-like bosses are like this should be the target. Like this, Slave Knight Gale from DS3 DLC, they're just fun, they're satisfying, and they're fair. Which, by the way, same thing goes for Prime Consort Radon, or Consort Radon in general. I think he overall is a very fair fight, super enjoyable to go against, especially once you learn all the timings. I've seen a lot of people that do like a full block, high stamina, endurance recovery build where you just block everything. You can cheese it for sure, or do lots of status effects, but I think in general, I would put the Radon fight very similar to R'Lana, and then it's very fair once you learn the patterns. There's not a whole bunch of nonsense that goes on. You just have to figure out what it's all about, learn to understand that some things are just illusions in phase 2, dodge those, and the extra damage is there. And they had kind of a bit of a callback to the princes from DS3, which I thought was pretty cool. And a special mention for Bale as well, which wasn't really the most difficult of fights, but he was certainly the most cinematic. I actually felt like I was in the middle of like a metal concert, like a metal music concert most of the time when I was watching Bale. Like just having him move around as this stumpy chicken that won't give up the fight, how the music played up when all the pyrotechnics went up in the air, his wings popping out. He was just such a really satisfying, visually aesthetic fight to see, and he was an awesome addition to the DLC. And some of the boss fights, like Gaius, at least in my opinion, just were bugged. I feel like Gaius was just bugged. There were so many times where you would actually get stuck in his hitbox for an attack, and that attack would roll into you multiple times in a row. Like if you get hit by the charge, you can get one shot by it because it hits you 3 times. If you get hit by a sweep, you can get one shot by it because it hits multiple times. I hope this is a bug because it makes the fight feel absolutely trash, and there are many times where Gaius was able to take me down when he definitely shouldn't have been able to, right? Like I had Divine Vow, or I had Golden Vow up, I had my buffs up, I had full HP, he did a hit, and then I saw my health bar do multiple segments on a single swing because the hitbox was just rolling on top of each other. Now, he's definitely one of those fights that can be very frustrating because not only does he have high mobility where he attacks and ends up far away, and unlike Mesmer where you can roll with him to keep up with him so you can keep up DPS on him, it was hard to do that most of the time just because he was so freaking fast and always running around. So unless, again, you were running a stagger build, you were having trouble keeping damage on him most of the time. But I think the biggest problem with Gaius, and one of the reasons why I think his fight as implemented, it was pretty awful, was just because there was just so many bugs with the hitboxes. There are times where it felt like you dodged it and then you got hit by a lingering hitbox after the fact. There are times where you dodge like his charge attack and you get hit by the lingering hitbox, and the lingering hitbox rolls multiple damage sources on you and one-shots you. And also there's like his dash where he charges forward. There's a perfect place to dodge. Either you need to be running to the side and then roll, or you need to roll at a perfect angle so you avoid both the front tusks and the hitbox on his back feet as well. Half the time, if you're not rolling perfectly, you'll either avoid the tusks and get hit by the back feet, or you'll get hit by the tusks. You're just taking damage from this move because the hitboxes are just so dang poor on this thing. So I think if they can smooth this out, patch it, and improve it, the fight would generally be fine. I don't mind mounted fights where they're running around constantly. I'm also impressed with his abductor strength where he can hold on to the boar mid-air and then dragoon dive down on top of you. I like the gravity magic. I like his aggression. He was definitely like, my name! Sekiro callback, but in general, I think his hitboxes were just a complete mess. When it came to exploration, I think it was a wide range of experiences. And if you're someone who enjoys the art of video games and the expression of video games, you probably enjoyed how varied the exploration was in Elden Ring DLC. But if you're playing Shadow of the Erdtree for the gameplay experience, I think there's plenty of problems in the environment and the layout for this. First of all, there's 2 or 3 zones in Shadow of the Erdtree that felt extremely barren, with nothing going on, nothing interesting other than atmosphere. It was the mountain leading up to Bale, the abyssal forest before you discover Midra. All of these just felt like there was just almost nothing there. And the worst part is in abyssal forest, you can't even get on torrent. Like you can't even mount and ride around. So you're just walking at a snail's pace in an empty forest that occasionally has a rat or two. And it's just atmosphere. It's spooky. It's scary. There's like this like wind howling. It's dark. You don't know why the ground is mad. The goats are going mad with the frenzied flame. It's kind of like this pseudo horror feeling, but I feel like unless you found Midra's area early, you just spent a lot of time walking and burning time in this area. So I think it depends on how much appreciation you have for atmosphere. And I can see a lot of people that just really wouldn't enjoy this spot or the mountain leading up to Bale because it's just empty and feels kind of unfinished. And the same thing goes for the verticality of the DLC, which was quite different. Now, we initially got a teaser that the DLC would be about the size of Limgrave. It's actually bigger, but it feels way bigger because of how vertical the DLC was. And just like the Abyssal Forest and the mountain leading up to Bale, I feel like it has this kind of polarizing effect. You may have enjoyed how inaccessible many of the areas were because there was so much verticality. There was a lot of times where you could see where you needed to go, but you couldn't safely get there. And there was a lot of weird pathing. You had to go through the lake, you had to go underneath, you had to go through the catacombs. There was a lot of discovery required in order to navigate all the different areas of the DLC, which made a continent that wasn't as big as you think feel much bigger because there's so many areas that were inaccessible. And I think for that reason, it's a little bit more polarizing. I can definitely see people that are gameplay focused that get frustrated by this. They just want to get from A to B so they can fight the monsters, fight the boss, have a good time. Like there are people that love games that are more on rails. And I definitely can see people that are more into open world games and appreciate the exploration. So I think those two, they took some risks that probably paid off for some people or were a huge negative for others. And it's probably fine. Overall, I think it balanced out in the end. So it was about average there. But I think like world-wise, exploration-wise, there were definitely some huge misses for me. Now let's talk about Mesmer for a minute, because I think there's actually a concept that has been really permeated through a lot of the DLC, which is something that can be, again, very focused on punishing one or two specific playstyles. And I'm going to call it roll catching. It's technically not true roll catching. You can see it right there. It's more like it's punishing defensive rolls, which is a very similar concept, but it's more just about having layered attacks. And I think they did this a whole lot in the DLC. A lot of the attacks from a lot of the bosses have layers to them, so that if you're someone who primarily rolls through attacks, especially casters or high dexterity builds or builds that use like light armor, they end up using rolls a lot. And I think a lot of the designs for the encounters, especially Mesmer and many of the others, ended up having these kind of defensive roll catching mechanics in them, where you could dodge the spear, but you didn't dodge the fire. You could dodge Gaius's slam, but you didn't dodge the gravity. You could dodge Radahn's swing, but you didn't dodge the holy damage. So I think there's a lot of that goes through the game, and I think there's not as much of that in the base game of Elden Ring, which is a nice point for variety. It makes the bosses feel a little bit different. They require slightly different strategy or more precise rolling and more precise jumping than we had in the base game, which makes the DLC feel unique and separate. But it is something that, again, if you were going at it with one specific playstyle, can rub you the wrong way. And I can tell you that Mesmer, more than any other boss, I whined the most on this one for that very reason, because I'm someone who likes to have medium build, light build, high rolling, and just more reactive. I like learning the timings. I like learning when I can punish, when the boss has minus frames, when I have minus frames. I like playing Souls games and Souls-like games like they're a fighting game, and having that little dance between the bosses so that you're knowing when to dodge. And I think having that as part of it makes it feel different, but it certainly is kind of a pain point when you first start playing, because if you're playing with a defensive roll mindset, it's going to catch you many, many times. I also have to give them credit, as it didn't seem like there were too many of the waterfowl dance problems. Personally for me, and this is the attack I'm talking about here, personally for me, I think Malenia is extremely overrated. I think that she could have been more of like a Rolana, but because she has waterfowl dance, I feel like she ends up becoming more of this like gimmick avoidance type fight because of that one ability. And if you take away waterfowl dance from Malenia, I don't think she has anywhere near the amount of bite that it has. And there weren't that many abilities or skills inside of the DLC that felt very similar to waterfowl dance. The best example I can think of is the one from Mesmer. And the reason that I don't like that, I kind of call these kind of attacks the I win buttons for the bosses, and like they get into a problem situation. So this is the one that Mesmer has that reminds me a lot of Waterfowl Dance. It's nowhere near as bad, but it is an option. So Mesmer can transition into this attack at any time, and if you're playing a melee build and you're in the middle of an animation, you're most likely going to get hit by the explosion because it is a melee spherical explosion that he can trigger near instantly at any time that he can I've seen him slide out of snake form into this ability and do it right away. So once he does this, you need to be far enough away or you need to dodge perfectly to avoid the explosion, and that's followed by a long attack chain. That's the only thing like that comes to mind immediately as feeling more Waterfowl Dancey, and that ability right there, if you decide you kind of have to play more defensively, you have to play further back and wait for that to have just been used so you can go in and attack. Now, if you're playing a ranged build, you probably care less, but there are certainly builds, especially if you're playing a slow melee build, where if you go in to hit him and he instantly does that, you're going to get hit by the explosion, and then you have to perfectly roll the rest of the combo, which is fine. It just feels like that's a little bit cheaty. He also had a suit like his penta thrust where he goes up in the air and stabs his polearm a bunch of times in phase 1 and partly in phase 2. He ends up feeling a little bit like Waterfowl Dance just because of the tracking on it. And this was true for a lot of the bosses, by the way, like Gaius for sure, Putrescent. They had just crazy, incredible tracking where if you roll, they will do a 270-degree turn and land on top of you and still deal damage just because of the amount of tracking that they have, which to me feels like it's kind of a cop-out. Like it feels like, yeah, if you give high movement speed and impossible tracking on a skill, of course it's going to be hard to avoid because you know, they're just going to stick to you to like glue, which to me is the Waterfowl Dance problem because she's able to clear, you know, a third of the arena in one go, and then she glues to your hitbox at maximum speed and just like tracks you like an insane, super smart AI system. The tracking on it is actually ridiculous. There's also a bunch of bosses that I really enjoyed that weren't really all that challenging, but were pretty cinematic and enjoyable to go through. So like Romina, which I didn't find her to be that challenging, basically is 2024's version of Quelaag from DS1. We just have this freaky, and one thing I really liked about the Romina fight is it felt like I was fighting like General Grievous because she has 3 arms, technically, the centipede, the scorpion tail, and her polearm staff. It just feels like sometimes you're paying attention to 2 of the arms and you miss the 3rd one and it hits you, so it keeps you on your toes. And I also really appreciate the fact that you are fighting a Scarlet Rot boss in the Scarlet Rot zone, in the Scarlet Rot area, and there isn't a bunch of natural Scarlet Rot buildup from the floor you're standing in. Thank you so much for doing that. That is so enjoyable versus what they could have done for this fight. I also really liked the Meteor Mother of Fingers fight. I didn't find this fight all that challenging, but it was super cinematic. I loved how they went for more of like a orchestral organ kind of OST with this, with all the tubes hanging from the ceiling, so that when the like organ like instrument kicked up and started going off, it felt like the tubes were playing it in my head. She also had a bunch of really fun encounter mechanics, and like when the blade starts spinning around, there's effects everywhere. I thought this fight was super cinematic. It was creepy and weird and made me uncomfortable in really different, unique ways, and I think it also played into the same bucket as the Bale fight, where it wasn't really particularly challenging once you understood the timings and the mechanics, but overall it was a very enjoyable fight to be a part of, and it reminded me a little bit of the water spider from Bloodborne 2, where you have this vast open area that you're teleported to, and there's this creepy, weird looking boss that you don't know what's going on, spawns little ads that get in your face, and you're weirded out the whole time. Another special shout out for the Dancing Lion. I actually loved this fight. I decided to keep Freya with me because I thought there was going to be some quest line thing with her later on, but this fight, like the fact that it changed with the OST, the movement was very unique, the animations were super unique, like having the 2 guys in a horse costume kind of aesthetic made reading some of the attacks initially very strange and different. The fact that they had the multiple elements like the avatar made it feel really cool and really unique, and the OST was a certified banger. I think this fight was an awesome addition to the Souls franchise. And that's all I got. I think overall it was, like I said, like an 8 or a 9, super good, one of the better DLCs we've had from FromSoft overall. It definitely had its flaws, but I think it's a great addition to Elden Ring and something that I think once people adapt and get into the game, that they're certainly going to love. And it also adds a lot to the core game as well, because you can take all the new DLC combinations and items and builds and experiences and then go back into the base game with them and vice versa. And I think there's a lot here to chew on for the coming years as people replay Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree. But let me know what your thoughts are down below. Did you like the DLC? Did you not? And what are your stance and thoughts on it overall? If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.